January 17, 1943, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The jungle exhales its humid breath across the ridgeline as dawn breaks over Henderson Field. An American artillery battery, the 11th Marines, 155 howitzers, sits in calculated positions among the coconut palms. The gun crews move with practiced economy, their boots sinking into volcanic soil still damp from overnight rain. In the pre-dawn darkness, a technical sergeant named Robert Whitman holds something unremarkable in his calloused hands, a cylindrical device no larger than a coffee thermos, painted olive drab, weighing perhaps 2 pounds. It screws into the nose of a high-explosive shell with satisfying precision. The metal is cool to the touch despite the tropical heat already gathering strength with the sunrise. This object, this innocuous cylinder of machined steel and delicate electronics, represents something the Japanese High Command has not yet comprehended. It is a VT fuse, a variable time proximity fuse, and it contains within its compact housing a complete miniaturized radio transmitter and receiver capable of withstanding forces that would liquefy human bone. When the 155 Michelle leaves the barrel at nearly 2,000 feet per second, this fuse will experience acceleration forces exceeding 20,000 times the force of gravity, 20,000 Gs. For perspective, a modern fighter pilot blacks out at 9. This device must not only survive the violence of launch, but must then transmit radio waves, receive their echo from the ground below, calculate the optimal detonation altitude, and execute that detonation, all in the span of seconds, while traveling at speeds that turn air itself into a battering ram. The Japanese soldiers dug into their bunkers along the Matanikau River, 2 miles distant, have no conceptual framework for what is about to happen to them. To understand the transformation that the VT fuse represented, one must first understand what warfare in the Pacific had become by early 1943. The Japanese military establishment had prepared for island defense with meticulous attention to terrain, fortification, and the calculated expenditure of lives. Their defensive doctrine, refined through combat in China and early Pacific victories, relied on a simple mathematical reality. Attackers suffer greater casualties than defenders when forced to assault prepared positions. The jungles and volcanic terrain of the Pacific Islands magnified this advantage exponentially. Japanese defensive positions were engineering marvels of economy and lethality. Soldiers carved bunkers into hillsides with interlocking fields of fire, often reinforcing them with coconut logs capable of stopping .50 caliber rounds. They positioned machine guns to create crossfires that turned approaches into killing zones. Artillery and mortar positions were carefully camouflaged and registered on every likely avenue of advance. The defenders knew every fold in the terrain, every natural choke point. They had rehearsed fields of fire and ranged their weapons with precision. Against such positions, American artillery had traditionally employed one of 2 fusing options, both with significant limitations. Contact fuses detonated on impact, useful against structures but largely ineffective against troops in defilade or foxholes. The explosion's energy was absorbed by earth and vegetation, and shrapnel traveled in trajectories that allowed soldiers below ground level to survive. Time fuses, set to detonate at specific intervals after firing, could achieve airbursts if calculated correctly, but required accurate knowledge of range, meteorological conditions, and shell velocity. In the chaos of jungle warfare, with rapidly changing tactical situations and limited observation, time fuses were approximations at best. A shell set to burst at 20 feet might detonate at 40, or at 5, or not at all if the timing mechanism failed. The result was a grinding arithmetic of attrition. To neutralize a Japanese bunker complex might require hundreds of shells, fired in prolonged barrages that consumed vast quantities of ammunition, exhausted gun crews, and gave defenders time to take shelter in the deepest portions of their fortifications. After the barrage lifted, Japanese soldiers would emerge from their holes, man their weapons, and exact a terrible price from attacking infantry. The cycle would repeat. Mountains of brass casings accumulated behind American lines. Supply ships burned fuel crossing thousands of miles of ocean to deliver more shells. Men died while artillery officers calculated angles and timing mechanisms with slide rules and prayer. The Japanese military had studied this arithmetic. They understood it. Their confidence in island defense rested upon it. Every fortification built, every soldier deployed to hold a position, was a calculated investment in that arithmetic of attrition. Let the Americans expend their resources against prepared defenses. Let them learn that every yard of Pacific soil would cost them disproportionately. Eventually, the calculus suggested, the cost would become unsustainable. The Americans would negotiate. The Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere would endure. This confidence permeated Japanese defensive planning from Guadalcanal to Tarawa to Iwo Jima. It shaped the allocation of resources, the training of troops, the very psychology of defense. Japanese soldiers were taught to view their fortified positions as nearly impregnable against conventional artillery. Take shelter during bombardment. Emerge when it lifts. Kill the infantry attempting to advance. This had worked against the Chinese. It had worked in Malaya. It would work against the Americans. Then the fuses arrived. The proximity fuse was born not from military necessity, but from a problem in anti-aircraft defense. In 1939, as war consumed Europe, British scientists confronted a fundamental challenge. Aircraft moved too quickly and unpredictably for anti-aircraft shells with contact or time fuses to reliably intercept them. A shell might pass within lethal radius of a bomber, but fail to detonate because it didn't strike the aircraft directly and couldn't be timed precisely enough for its exact position. The solution required a fuse that could sense its own proximity to a target and detonate automatically at the optimal distance. The theoretical physics was elegant. Radio waves travel at the speed of light. A transmitter in the nose of a shell could emit radio frequency energy that would reflect off nearby objects, aircraft, ground, whatever lay in the shell's path. A receiver in the same fuse could detect this reflected energy. As the distance to the reflecting surface decreased, the strength of the reflected signal would increase according to the inverse square law. When the signal strength indicated the shell had reached optimal detonation range, typically 20 to 30 feet from the target, an electronic trigger could fire the detonator. The engineering reality was nearly impossible. The fuse had to be small enough to fit in a shell nose, typically a cavity 3 inches in diameter and 6 inches deep. It had to contain a complete radio system, transmitter, receiver, antenna, power supply, amplifier, trigger mechanism. It had to survive being fired from a gun barrel, experiencing accelerations that would shatter any conventional electronic component. It had to operate reliably in temperature extremes from Arctic cold to tropical heat, in rain, in humidity that corroded contacts and degraded insulation. It had to be manufacturable in quantities of millions, by workers with ordinary industrial skills, at a cost the military budget could sustain. It had to be sufficiently foolproof that exhausted gun crews could install it correctly in darkness under fire. And critically, it had to be kept secret. If the enemy captured an intact example and reverse-engineered it, the advantage would evaporate. Every fuse fired over enemy territory risked compromise. The Americans inherited the initial British research in 1940 and threw industrial and scientific resources at the problem with characteristic intensity. The National Defense Research Committee, predecessor to the Office of Scientific Research and Development, coordinated efforts across multiple institutions. Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, the Carnegie Institution, the National Bureau of Standards. Engineers developed miniaturized vacuum tubes capable of surviving artillery launch forces, a feat requiring entirely new manufacturing techniques. The tubes were smaller than a thumb and potted in compounds that cushioned them during the violence of acceleration. Batteries had to provide reliable power while experiencing forces that would crush conventional cells. Antenna designs had to radiate and receive effectively from the confined space of a shell in supersonic flight. By 1942, after thousands of test firings and continuous refinement, the VT fuse had evolved into a production-ready system. The device that emerged from this crucible of innovation contained 5 miniature vacuum tubes, a wet cell battery, transmitter and receiver circuits, and a mechanical arming system that prevented premature detonation. The entire assembly was sealed, waterproof, and could withstand 20,000 Gs at launch, 5,000 Gs during supersonic flight, and the temperature variations of traveling from sea level to altitude in seconds. In August 1942, the first combat use occurred when the USS Cleveland fired VT-fused 5-inch shells at attacking Japanese aircraft. The results were immediately apparent: significantly higher kill rates per shell fired. But this application, while valuable, was limited to naval anti-aircraft defense where fuses could be controlled. The Navy could ensure that duds falling into the ocean were unrecoverable. The revolutionary potential lay elsewhere: field artillery against ground targets. For months, American commanders faced an agonizing restriction. They possessed a weapon that could transform ground combat, but security protocols initially forbade its use where the enemy might recover intact examples. The fuses were too secret, too valuable, the technology too revolutionary to risk compromise. Naval use was acceptable. The ocean swallowed the evidence of duds. But land warfare meant enemy soldiers crawling over shell-pocked terrain, collecting fragments, potentially finding unexploded shells with intact fuses. The risk seemed too great. The restriction gnawed at artillery officers who understood what the weapon could do. They had seen the test results, the statistics from controlled firings. A single battery of 105 howitzers, firing VT-fused shells, could achieve casualty rates against troops in the open equivalent to 10 batteries firing conventional ammunition. Against fortified positions, the advantage was nearly as dramatic. The VT fuse detonated at optimal airburst height automatically, regardless of ranging errors, terrain variations, or meteorological conditions that affected time fuses. Every shell became a precision airburst weapon. The mathematical certainty of it was beautiful and terrible. On Guadalcanal, as American forces ground forward against prepared Japanese defenses in late 1942 and early 1943, the calculus began to shift. The strategic value of the island, and the lives being lost taking it yard by yard, began to outweigh the security risk. Combat commanders argued their case up the chain of command. Lives were being spent in abundance against Japanese bunkers and trenches. The VT fuse could save those lives, perhaps hundreds or thousands of them, if only they were permitted to use it. The compromise came in January 1943. VT fuses could be employed in field artillery, but only under specific conditions: overwhelming fire missions where recovery of duds would be unlikely due to the density of bombardment and the speed of American advance following the barrage. The enemy would be given no time to methodically search the impact area. Infantry would overrun positions immediately. Any technological advantage gained by the Japanese from studying fragments would be mitigated by the reality that they would be studying fragments while being overrun. The 11th Marines, positioned around Henderson Field, received their first shipment of VT fuses in early January. The technical specifications came with the crates: optimal use against troops in defilade bunker complexes, trench systems, recommended settings for various shell types, safety protocols for arming. The gun crews read the documentation with the skeptical attention of men who had fired thousands of shells and knew the gap between theoretical performance and battlefield reality. They would not remain skeptical long. To appreciate what happened when VT fuses entered combat, one must understand the ballistics of airbursts and the vulnerability of human beings to fragmentation. An artillery shell is, in essence, a delivery system for metal fragments traveling at lethal velocities. When a high-explosive shell detonates, the explosive charge shatters the shell casing into hundreds or thousands of fragments, shrapnel, that radiate outward from the point of detonation. The fragment's lethality depends on their size, shape, and velocity. A fragment the size of a pencil eraser, traveling at 2,000 feet per second, will penetrate body armor and cause catastrophic wounds. The effectiveness of this fragmentation depends critically on where the shell detonates relative to the target. A shell exploding on contact with the ground creates a hemispherical pattern of fragments, with much of the energy absorbed by Earth. Soldiers in foxholes, behind logs, or in shallow depressions can survive contact bursts that detonate mere yards away. The fragments pass overhead or are stopped by minimal cover. A shell exploding 20 feet above the ground creates a different pattern entirely. The fragments rain downward at angles that render foxholes into graves and bunkers into abattoirs. There is no overhead cover in a hastily dug position. A steel helmet provides no protection against shrapnel arriving from above at supersonic speeds. The mathematical difference is dramatic. Studies conducted during and after the war demonstrated that an airburst at optimal height was 5 to 10 times more effective against troops in defilade than a contact burst. Against troops in the open, the advantage was somewhat less but still substantial, perhaps 3 times the casualty radius. The challenge had always been achieving that optimal airburst consistently. Time fuses were approximations. A shell set to burst at 20 feet might actually burst at 10 or 40, depending on variables the firer could not perfectly control. Variations in propellant temperature, microscopic differences in shell weight, wind conditions, even the wear state of the gun barrel. The VT fuse eliminated this uncertainty. Its radio altimeter measured actual height above terrain with precision. As the shell descended in its ballistic arc, the fuse transmitted continuous radio pulses and measured the return time of reflections from the ground. When the measured height reached the optimal range, programmed into the fuse design, typically 20 to 30 feet, the firing circuit triggered. The detonation occurred at precisely the height for maximum lethality against ground targets, regardless of ranging errors, terrain irregularities, or environmental conditions. The Japanese soldiers waiting in their positions along the Matanikau had no framework for understanding this change. They had survived artillery barrages before. The doctrine was clear: take shelter during the bombardment, wait for the inevitable lull when the guns would cease firing to allow American infantry to advance, then emerge and man weapons. The Americans always stopped shooting before their infantry came forward, otherwise they risked hitting their own men. In that interval between bombardment and assault lay the opportunity to exact revenge for the terror of the shelling. This doctrine had worked at Shanghai, at Bataan, at 100 other battlefields. It would not work today. The fire mission came through at 6:20 hours on January 17, 1943. Japanese forces had been located in a bunker complex approximately 2,000 yards northeast of Henderson Field, positioned to interdict American patrols moving along the coastal track. Aerial reconnaissance had identified at least 15 fortified positions with interlocking fields of fire, occupied by an estimated 200 soldiers. Previous attempts to reduce the position with conventional artillery had required sustained bombardment followed by costly infantry assaults. Casualties had been significant. Today would be different. 6 M155 howitzers from Battery B, 11th Marines, received the fire mission. Each gun had been supplied with 30 VT-fused shells, 180 shells total for the initial bombardment. The guns were laid with careful attention to data transmitted from forward observers: range, bearing, meteorological conditions. The corrections were less critical than usual. The VT fuses would compensate for most ranging errors, but artillery crews are creatures of precision, and they performed their calculations with habitual thoroughness. At 6:33, the first gun fired. The 155 shell, weighing 95 pounds, left the barrel at 1,850 feet per second. The VT fuse in its nose experienced acceleration forces of approximately 20,000 Gs as the shell transitioned from stationary to supersonic in the length of the barrel, a distance of about 20 feet, covered in roughly 1/100th of a second. The forces involved would have pulverized any unprotected electronic device. The miniature vacuum tubes, cushioned in their potting compound, survived intact. The mechanical arming system released its safety lock as centrifugal force from the shell's rotation armed the firing circuit. The shell arced upward, reaching an apex of approximately 3,000 feet before beginning its descent toward the Japanese positions. As it fell, the VT fuse transmitter began broadcasting radio pulses, and its receiver listened for returns. At 500 feet above ground, the return signals became detectable. At 200 feet, they strengthened. At 100 feet, the fuse circuitry processed the intensifying returns and calculated the closing rate. At 32 feet above the Japanese bunker line, as the shell descended at terminal velocity, the fuse triggered. The detonation occurred precisely where physics and engineering intended, high enough that the burst pattern covered maximum ground area, low enough that fragments retained lethal velocity. 15 pounds of composition B explosive converted the shell casing into hundreds of jagged fragments that sleeted downward and outward at velocities exceeding 2,000 feet per second. The fragments encountered men in foxholes and behind log barricades. They encountered the roofs of bunkers. They encountered flesh and bone. The second shell detonated 3 seconds later, 40 yards from the first, at precisely 28 feet of altitude. Then the third, the fourth, a rolling drumbeat of airbursts that stitched across the Japanese position with methodical precision. Each shell detonated at optimal height. Each shell scattered its deadly payload across an area that conventional contact bursts could never achieve. There was no randomness in the pattern, no shells wasted on impact bursts that threw most of their energy into the ground. Every detonation was a textbook airburst, the kind that artillery officers dreamed of achieving but rarely saw with conventional fusing. From forward observation posts, American spotters watched through binoculars and saw something new. The Japanese position, which in previous bombardments had seemed to absorb punishment stoically with soldiers emerging relatively intact after the barrage, was being systematically destroyed. Secondary explosions marked ammunition stores detonating. Palm fronds that had provided camouflage were shredded. Bunker roofs that had seemed impervious to conventional fire collapsed under the rain of fragments. Most tellingly, there was no return fire during the lulls between shells. The usual pattern, American artillery fires, Japanese soldiers take cover, Americans pause to adjust fire, Japanese soldiers emerge to man weapons and fire back, had broken down. Nothing was emerging from those positions. The bombardment continued for 12 minutes. 180 VT-fused shells, each detonating at optimal height, each delivering its payload of fragments with maximum efficiency. When the guns fell silent and forward observers called for infantry to advance, the Marines who moved toward the Japanese positions did so with the caution of men who had learned that silence after a barrage could mean survival, that bunkers could shelter men who would emerge to kill attackers. They advanced with weapons ready, expecting resistance. They found carnage instead. The scene that greeted American infantry moving through the former Japanese position defied their previous experience of combat. Bunkers that should have contained living, fighting soldiers held corpses. Foxholes that should have sheltered men from conventional artillery had become open graves. The pattern of wounds told the story, fragments entering from above, through areas of the body that soldiers in prone positions normally protected. Head wounds. wounds to the back and shoulders. The geometry of death had changed. A Marine lieutenant named James Rothwell, advancing with the 1st Infantry Wave, later recorded his observations in a letter home that was excerpted in a regimental history. "We expected the usual hell, expected to lose men taking those bunkers. Instead, we walked through a slaughterhouse. The Japs were dead in their holes. Some looked like they'd barely had time to register what was happening. The doc said he'd never seen wounds like it, all from above. Said it was like the shells knew exactly where to explode." The lieutenant's observation, stripped of its technical understanding, identified the essential truth. The shells did know exactly where to explode. That was the revolution. Japanese documents captured after the battle and translated by intelligence officers revealed the defenders' confusion. A diary found on the body of a sergeant described the barrage. "The shells burst above us, not on the ground as before. Above, there is no protection. The men are crying that the bunkers are useless. I do not know what to tell them." The mathematical results confirmed what observers had seen. Against a defensive position that had previously required multiple days of bombardment and sustained infantry assault, with expected American casualties in the dozens, the VT-fused bombardment had achieved complete neutralization in 12 minutes with 0 American combat casualties. The Japanese force of approximately 200 soldiers had been reduced to fewer than 30 survivors, most of those too severely wounded to offer meaningful resistance. The casualty ratio, shells fired versus enemy casualties, was unprecedented in the Pacific campaign to that point. Artillery officers reviewing the after-action reports saw in the numbers what they had hoped to see: a fundamental change in the arithmetic of warfare. One battery with VT fuses could achieve what had previously required the massed fires of multiple battalions. The implications spiraled outward. Fewer guns needed to support an operation meant more guns available for other operations. Fewer shells needed to neutralize a target meant reduced logistic strain. Ships could carry other cargo. Transport aircraft could deliver other supplies. The mathematical advantage compounded across every level of military operations. Within weeks, VT fuses were in high demand across the Pacific theater. Every artillery unit wanted them. Production facilities in the United States ramped up to meet demand, but the devices were complex, and production was limited by the availability of skilled technicians capable of assembling the miniature components. Priorities had to be established: which operations would receive VT-fused ammunition, which commanders could be trusted with the security requirements. By mid-1943, as American forces prepared for the Central Pacific Offensive that would carry them through the Gilberts, Marshalls, and Marianas, VT fuses had become standard issue for major operations. The fuses arrived in wooden crates marked with cryptic designations that revealed nothing of their contents. Gun crews learned to handle them with the reverent care usually reserved for much more delicate equipment, not because they were fragile in the traditional sense, but because their value was understood. Each fuse represented thousands of dollars of research and manufacturing. Yes, but more importantly, each represented lives saved in the infantry companies that would advance behind the barrage. What the technical reports and casualty statistics could not fully capture was the psychological transformation that VT fuses created, both among American forces and their Japanese adversaries. American artillery crews, who had often felt their contribution to battle was abstract, firing shells toward map coordinates, rarely seeing the direct results of their work, now received consistent reports of devastating effectiveness. Forward observers radioed back descriptions of destroyed positions, of neutralized bunkers, of objectives taken with minimal casualties. The gun crews could connect their technical proficiency directly to lives saved. This was not abstract mathematics anymore. This was immediate, visible proof that their work mattered in the most fundamental way. Their comrades were coming home alive. For Japanese forces, The experience was the inverse, a growing realization that the defensive doctrine they had relied upon was obsolete. Reports filtered up through Japanese command structures describing the new American artillery tactic. Shells that burst overhead with uncanny consistency. Positions that had seemed secure becoming death traps. The psychological impact compounded with each engagement. Japanese soldiers in prepared positions, who had previously weathered bombardments with reasonable confidence in their survival, now faced an existential question. What value did fortification hold if shells exploded above the fortifications? Captured Japanese after-action reports from later battles in the Central Pacific reflect this dawning understanding. A document recovered from Tarawa describes American artillery as employing some new technique or fusing method that causes consistent airbursts over our positions. The men are demoralized. They do not believe the bunkers will protect them. Similar reports came from Saipan, from Peleliu, from Iwo Jima. The recurring theme was helplessness against a weapon that negated the advantages of terrain and fortification. This psychological dimension should not be underestimated. The Japanese military had built its defensive strategy around the premise that fortified positions could exact disproportionate casualties from attackers, making the island-by-island American advance unsustainable. When that premise collapsed, when bunkers became tombs rather than shelters, the entire strategic calculus shifted. Japanese commanders were left with no good options: surrender, which cultural doctrine forbade, or fight from positions that provided no real protection against the new American artillery. The result was an acceleration of the bitter mathematics of attrition, but now the arithmetic favored the Americans overwhelmingly. Island after island fell with casualty ratios that, while still terrible by any human measure, represented vast improvements over early Pacific battles. The VT fuse was not the sole factor. Improvements in amphibious tactics, air superiority, naval gunfire support, and growing American combat experience all contributed. But it was a significant multiplier of American combat power. Behind every VT fuse used in combat lay an industrial achievement of staggering scale. By war's end, American factories would produce over 22 million proximity fuses, 22 million miniature radio systems, each containing 5 vacuum tubes, each capable of surviving 20,000 G-forces, each assembled by hand by workers who often did not fully understand what they were building. Security classification meant that workers in the production chain were compartmentalized, each group knowing only their specific task: assembling tube subassemblies, winding coils, potting components, final assembly, testing. The complete picture of how the pieces functioned together was restricted to engineering staff and cleared personnel. The production facilities themselves were marvels of wartime industrial expansion. The Westinghouse plant in Bloomfield, New Jersey, converted automobile assembly techniques to electronics production, using conveyor systems and standardized workstations to achieve output that would have seemed impossible in 1940. Women comprised a large percentage of the workforce, their dexterity and attention to detail proving essential for the fine work of assembling miniature vacuum tubes and installing them into fuse bodies. Photographs from the period show rows of women at benches, working under bright lights with magnifying glasses and specialized tools, each performing repetitive motions with precision that meant the difference between a functional fuse and a dud. Quality control was obsessive. Every fuse underwent testing before leaving the factory: electrical tests of circuit function, mechanical tests of arming mechanisms, vibration tests to simulate the forces of firing. A certain percentage were randomly selected for complete live-fire testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, where 155 howitzers fired fuses into instrumented test ranges that measured detonation height and reliability. The acceptable failure rate was stringent, less than 1% duds. Any batch that exceeded this threshold was rejected and reworked. The logistics of distributing 22 million fuses across 2 ocean theaters and multiple services represented its own organizational challenge. Ships carried crates of fuses alongside conventional ammunition. Supply depots in forward areas maintained controlled storage facilities. The security requirement meant that fuses could not be stored just anywhere. They required locked facilities with limited access. Artillery units received their allocations based on operational priorities, sometimes just days or hours before major offensives. The choreography of getting the right number of fuses to the right guns at the right time required coordination across multiple echelons of supply and command. And through all of this industrial and logistical complexity, the secret held. Despite millions of fuses fired in combat, despite thousands of duds that failed to detonate, despite Japanese soldiers recovering fragments and unexploded examples, the enemy never successfully reverse-engineered the technology or fielded a comparable weapon. German efforts to understand captured proximity fuses made some progress, but never achieved production-ready systems before war's end. Japanese attempts were even less successful, hampered by resource shortages and the growing collapse of their industrial base under American aerial bombardment. The secret held because the technology was harder to replicate than it appeared. The miniature vacuum tubes required specialized manufacturing knowledge. The circuitry design involved subtle choices in component values and layout that were not obvious from examining fragments. The batteries used proprietary chemistry. Even understanding the basic principle, radio proximity detection, did not automatically confer the ability to manufacture reliable fuses at scale. The Americans had the advantage of time, resources, and an intact industrial base. Their enemies had none of these by 1943. In the stories that veterans told after the war, in the memoirs and oral histories and letters home, a recurring motif appears. The VT fuse as symbol of American industrial and technological superiority. To men who fought the war at the tactical level, the infantrymen and tankers and engineers and medics, the proximity fuse represented something larger than its immediate tactical benefit. It represented what America could do that its enemies could not: produce weapons of extraordinary sophistication in quantities that defied imagination, then deploy those weapons effectively across global distances. Japanese soldiers on Pacific Islands often faced material shortages. Rations were reduced. Ammunition was conserved. Equipment could not be replaced. The machinery of Japanese logistics was breaking down under American submarine interdiction and aerial bombardment. Defenders on islands knew that resupply was unlikely, that they would fight with what they had and no more. This material reality shaped Japanese tactical thinking. Every round had to count. Every position had to be held because there was no fallback supported by fresh supplies and reinforcements. American forces operated in a different material universe. An artillery battery expending 30 VT-fused shells, 60 pounds of electronics and precision manufacturing per shell, representing thousands of dollars of production cost and sophisticated technology, in a 12-minute fire mission, was not engaging in reckless expenditure. It was engaging in calculated efficiency. Those 30 shells achieved what hundreds of conventional shells might not have achieved. More shells were available if needed. More fuses would arrive with the next supply convoy. The logistics system stretching back across the Pacific to the American industrial heartland was vast, resilient, redundant. It could absorb losses and continue operating. It could scale up production to meet demand. It could innovate and improve. To Japanese soldiers experiencing the receiving end of this material abundance, in the form of VT-fused artillery shells exploding overhead with uncanny precision, the psychological impact went beyond the immediate terror of combat. It confirmed what many already suspected. They were fighting an enemy with resources they could not match, technology they could not replicate, industrial capacity they could not hope to overcome. The proximity fuse became shorthand for this disparity. American soldiers might speak of VT rounds or posit fuses with casual familiarity, unaware that each fuse represented the pinnacle of contemporary electronics engineering. Japanese soldiers, when they spoke of the new American shells at all, did so with the recognition that they were facing something fundamentally beyond their ability to counter. This symbolic dimension of the VT fuse extended beyond the Pacific. When proximity fuses began to be used in the European theater in late 1944, particularly during the Battle of the Bulge, where their effectiveness against German infantry in the Ardennes forest was devastating, they reinforced the narrative of American technological and industrial dominance. German soldiers who had grown accustomed to their own forces possessing technological advantages, better tanks in some categories, advanced aircraft, superior small arms in certain respects, confronted an American weapon that had no German equivalent. The psychological impact compounded tactical effectiveness. By 1944, as American forces moved from the outer islands toward the Japanese home islands, the employment of VT-fused artillery had evolved from experimental wonder weapon to routine standard practice. Artillery officers incorporated proximity fuses into fire planning with the same casual competence that they applied to choosing shell types and propellant charges. The questions were no longer, can we use these? Or will they work? But rather, how many do we need? And which targets justify their use? The evolution of tactics reflected growing experience. Forward observers learned to call for VT fire against specific target types, troop concentrations in defilade, bunker complexes, counterattack formations. Fire direction centers developed standardized procedures for computing VT fire missions. Gun crews mastered the specialized handling requirements. The fuses had to be installed with proper torque. They required specific storage conditions. There were safety protocols for arming and firing that differed slightly from conventional fusing. The battlefield effectiveness continued to prove itself in engagement after engagement. On Saipan in June 1944, American artillery fired over 15,000 VT-fused shells during the three-week battle, achieving casualty rates against Japanese positions that allowed Marine and Army infantry to advance with significantly reduced losses compared to earlier island assaults. On Peleliu in September 1944, despite the island's extreme defensive terrain, honeycombed coral ridges that provided natural fortifications, VT-fused artillery helped neutralize positions that conventional fire had barely scratched. On Iwo Jima in February 1945, even against the most heavily fortified Japanese defenses encountered in the war, VT fuses provided the Marines with effective fire support that degraded Japanese combat power before the infantry closed with surviving defenders. The statistics accumulated across these battles tell the story in cold numbers. American artillery expended fewer total shells per objective taken. American infantry casualties per yard advanced declined, even as Japanese defensive skill and determination remained undiminished. The time required to reduce fortified positions shortened. All of these metrics reflected the cumulative advantage that VT fuses provided, not a miracle weapon that eliminated combat losses, but a significant tactical multiplier that made American offensive operations more efficient and less costly in lives. Yet this increased efficiency came with its own psychological costs. Veterans of later Pacific battles sometimes reflected on the industrial nature of combat that VT fuses exemplified. An artillery forward observer named Thomas Bryce, who directed fire missions on Okinawa in 1945, later wrote, "We were dropping shells on those positions with such precision, such terrible precision, that it stopped feeling like combat and started feeling like, I don't know." Manufacturing death. The VT rounds went exactly where they needed to, did exactly what they were designed to do, and the results were exactly as predicted. Men died according to mathematical models. It was effective. It saved our guys' lives. But God help me, it felt like we'd turned killing into an engineering problem we'd solved. This discomfort, the recognition that technology had made slaughter more efficient and therefore more terrible, was not unique to VT fuses, but the weapon's precision made the abstraction harder to maintain. Artillery had always created distance between killer and killed, but VT fuses refined that killing to such precision that the abstraction itself became uncomfortable. The shells did not miss. They did not waste their effects on empty ground. They found their targets with mathematical certainty and executed their function with programmed efficiency. The randomness that had characterized artillery fire, that had at least allowed for the possibility that a shell might detonate harmlessly, had been engineered away. What remained was certainty. The certainty of optimal detonation, optimal fragmentation pattern, optimal lethality. What is often absent from historical accounts of the VT fuse is serious consideration of its impact on Japanese soldiers as individual human beings rather than as abstract enemy forces or targets of military operations. The historical record focuses, understandably, on American tactical advantages and lives saved. But the weapon's effectiveness was built on its lethality, and that lethality fell upon young men who had been conscripted into service, who had been told they were defending their homeland from invasion, who died in foxholes and bunkers under airbursts they could not shelter from or counter. The Japanese defensive strategy that VT fuses helped defeat was brutal in its own right. It demanded that soldiers fight to the death from prepared positions, accepting near-certain death as the price of delaying American advance. The strategy sought to make every yard of ground so costly in American lives that continuation of the war would become politically unsustainable. In this sense, the VT fuse offered a grim counterargument. America could make Japanese defensive positions so untenable that continuation of resistance, not continuation of American advance, would become unsustainable. From the Japanese perspective, the experience of being subjected to VT-fused bombardment represented a particular kind of helplessness. Soldiers in bunkers had previously possessed at least the comfort of shelter, the knowledge that deep enough holes and thick enough overheat